Hello, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I am your host, Dalia Gebrial, and I'm joined today by the wonderful Mike Bankole. Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks, Dalia. It's good to be on a show with you. I thought this is a double act that rarely gets to do Novara Lives together, but looking forward to what should be a fun show.
Coming up later tonight, an Israeli academic has been stopped at the US border and questioned for his views on genocide in Gaza. Residents in Devon have been told their tap water is not safe to drink following the outbreak of a parasitic disease. And Netanyahu has used an interview with CNBC to rule out entirely, in explicit terms, a two-state solution. Stay tuned for all that. Keir Starmer has unveiled Labour's election pledges at a big-ticket event in Essex, except he isn't calling them pledges. Instead, Starmer outlined 6 first steps for a new Labour government, with economic stability at the top of his agenda.
Step 1, economic stability. Now, this is the very foundation of economic growth. Tough spending rules, yes, to keep inflation, taxes, and mortgages low. Because if you lose control of the economy, it's working people who will pay the price. Liz Truss lost control of the economy, and working people paid the price. Just about a week after her mini budget, I think it was a week, it may have been 5 or 6 days, I was in Wolverhampton with a young couple who had a 3-year-old child. And they wanted a second child to build their family. So they had identified a new home to buy. They got a mortgage, a provisional mortgage for it, that they could afford. They were excited about the future they were going to build. Liz Truss crashed the economy. Their mortgage offer literally went through the roof. They couldn't afford it. They had to cancel their plans. No more new home, no more moving on. Stuck. But they also made a much more profound decision. They decided that they couldn't afford a second child. Now, they're going to live with that decision for the rest of their lives. And I'm not prepared to allow an incoming Labour government ever to do that kind of damage to working people. This isn't just about the past, because Rishi Sunak has not learnt the lessons. He says he's going to abolish national insurance. That is a £46 billion unfunded tax cut. £46 billion. And that's why I can hardly believe I'm saying this. Stability is change. And that's why it has to be our first step.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the example that he goes for is Liz Truss crashing the economy, which was kind of this freak event. And it speaks to the way in which the Labour Party, Starmer's Labour Party, has sort of narrativized the problems of the last government as a competence issue, instead of actually going for the systemic reasons, the policy and ideological reasons why some people feel like they can't afford to have children. He hasn't really committed to addressing those kinds of core issues. It's a very classic Starmerite thing where he just kind of gives off this generic vibe of change, whilst actually refusing to commit to anything concrete that he could be asked about later that actually could deliver change. So very classic kind of Starmer move there. Starmer's speech was preceded by endorsements from figures in business and civil society, as well as, of course, former Tory voters. Also backing Labour was NHS patient Nathaniel Dye, who gave this personal account of what Tory misgovernment has meant for him.
My name is Nathaniel Dye, and I am dying of cancer. At first, I was told I'd have a rough year with treatment and surgery, then be free to live my life. When scans eventually happened, further spread was discovered and my prognosis worsened. It's all but certain that I'll be dead within 3 to 4 years. I was diagnosed 20 months ago and the clock keeps on ticking. I try not to think about what might have been if all the tests, scans, and appointments had happened more quickly. But I know I waited over 100 days for treatment when the government's target is 62, and there's a good chance that time spent on waiting lists has cut my life in half. When I received my terminal diagnosis, something deep inside me died that day. Hope. No, there isn't any hope for me beyond maybe enjoying another healthy summer or two, but that doesn't mean I've given up on hope entirely. My hope is for everyone else, that people can avoid ending up like me. How? I hope to see a Labour government elected, a Labour government that I know will cut waiting times by providing more scans and appointments more quickly. Wes Streeting has been through cancer treatment on the NHS. He knows what needs to be done. And I trust Keir Starmer to effect the positive change that's so desperately needed, to act on the principle that we all deserve the best possible care from an NHS that is publicly funded, free at the point of use, and most importantly, works in time to save lives.
Obviously, a deeply moving testimony there, one that is probably, unfortunately, familiar to many people living in Britain today. And reducing NHS waiting lists is Starmer's second pledge. It's a clear area of Tory failure and also an issue that matters a lot to most of the public, a fact that Starmer illustrated with this anecdote.
And a woman recognised me, and she called me over, and she said to me, and she showed me, she's got an ingrowing eyelid. It's red raw, swollen, and causing her a huge amount of pain and discomfort. And she said to me, I've been waiting 18 months for an appointment for the operation, and I've just been told I've got to wait another 12 months. She virtually pleaded with me to win the election to do something about it. That's not unusual. There are so many versions of this story, whether it's knees or hips, whatever the operation may be. That is the price that so many people are paying, and that's why we have to deal with it. 40,000 operations and appointments every single week, paid for by cracking down on tax avoiders and the non-dom tax status.
That was actually a rare gesture towards a concrete challenge to elite interests there with, addressing non-dom status. But it's worth mentioning that in typical Starmer fashion, he waited for the conservative and right-wing media to give him permission to do so. The Tories have already said that they're going to scrap non-dom status. I think they've actually already scrapped non-dom status. So it's that classic Starmer being behind the curve, always waiting for permission from interests that the Labour Party are not supposed to be aligned with to actually pursue the relatively more progressive parts of his agenda. The other first steps include setting up Great British Energy, cracking down on antisocial behaviour, tackling small boat gangs, and recruiting 6,500 new teachers. But there wasn't a lot of detail about how long a Labour government would take to reach these goals, nor how they would actually achieve them. Starmer did, however, describe them as fully costed and ready to go. And to show how serious he is about those promises, Starmer wrote them down on a piece of plastic.
So here we are. One card, 6 steps, in your hand, a plan to change the country. This is a message that we can take to every doorstep across the country, every doorstep across the country, and make that argument. Decline is not inevitable. Politics can make a difference. Britain will have a better future, and you can choose it with Labour. Stop the chaos with Labour. Turn the page with Labour. Return politics to service with Labour. And with patience, with determination, with these first steps, we can rebuild our country with Labour. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, that gimmick may look a bit familiar to some of you because it looks a lot like Tony Blair's pledge cards of the 1997 and 2001 elections. But Blair's pledges were substantive, measurable, and ambitious. In 1997, they included cutting class sizes to 30 or under for early primary years and getting 250,000 under 25-year-olds into work. There was also a commitment to no income tax rises. Blair also actually called them promises. In contrast, Starmer's first steps appear more vague and more than a little lackluster. And some in the press were quick to notice how slim Labour's promises have become.
You set out your 5 missions in January 2023. Voters have been waiting for quite a long time for flesh on the bones, but you've downsized your promises today. You promised the highest sustained economic growth in the G7. That becomes economic stability. You promised clean energy by 2030. That becomes setting up Great British Energy. Why are you scaling back your ambition? Is it for fear of breaking promises, or is it because you're so far ahead in the polls, you're lowering the bar? Thank you.
I'm not. I'm not scaling back our ambition absolutely at all. And it's very important, Beth, and thank you for raising this, because that is the way I've set this out has been a strategy I've been operating to for 4 years now, which is a strategy which was first to recognise the scale of the defeat of the Labour Party at the last general election, the worst defeat since 1935. And so stage one was change the Labour Party, change it, turn it inside out, facing the country and serving working people. Next stage, expose the government as incompetent, ably assisted by several of their prime ministers. The next stage, which you and others pushed me to, is right, well, now it's clear that you've changed the Labour Party, and it's clear to everyone this government's failing. What are your big ideas for the country? That's the missions that we set out last year. This is not to reduce the missions, it's to say, what's the first down payments on the delivery of those missions? What are the first steps that we can take? They're not the only steps, they're the first steps. The missions remain, but this is, if you like, the tangible steps that we will take to deliver on those missions. And that's why I said we'll look the public in the eye and say, these are the down payments, the first shoots. So we're not reducing the missions. We're putting flesh on the bones by saying these are the first steps we'll take in order to deliver the missions. But the missions, each and every single one of them, are there as the long-term ambitions, goals, targets, the driving purpose of the incoming Labour government.
It's just impossible to believe anything that he says because he's already laid so much groundwork for breaking what few promises he's made. Not only are we talking about the fact that he does these major U-turns on these really flagship popular policies like the £28 billion a year of green investment, but also he shows himself to be someone who folds under like the slightest threat of criticism from the right-wing press. And we know that the right-wing press in this country will basically never get on board with a Labour Party government. They will always take that kind of government to task, especially if that government is trying to do anything that actually warrants it being called a Labour Party or a Labour government. And so when you have someone who is just so clearly easily spooked by any kind of indication that they might get any pressure or any backlash from vested interests, it's like, okay, even if you truly believe in this moment that you will be able to deliver on some of these vague kind of vibes that you're throwing out there, I at least don't have any faith that you have the mettle and the conviction to actually see it through. Now, look, I'm never going to be someone to whitewash Blairism. But Mike, what does it say that the starting point of Starmerism is even worse than Blairism?
I think this is a lot, and I just look at these pledges, and in some ways they're inoffensive, but they're actually just so inadequate for the problems that we face. I mean, they're not even measures; they're the first steps, is what he's called them, and they're like vague enough that you can kind of evade criticism for not delivering on them, but then they're also so vague they don't really mean much. And there's loads of tweets going around on Twitter, comparing these kind of 6 first steps to his initial 10 pledges. And what's hilarious is you can kind of see the contradiction and the contrast in the kind of campaign Starmer ran on in 2020 and what he's saying, what he's doing now. So he speaks about needing a new border force security system or something along those lines. When in 2020 it was we need, migrant justice. There's no real focus of even the language of climate justice in these first steps. So much of the tone, so much of the substance of what he's offering now is so different to that. And when you think about where we are as a nation, right, after 14 years of the Conservatives in power, child poverty is soaring. We have homelessness soaring. We have thousands of people in insecure work. We have the university sector, which we both know quite well, Dalia. It's on its feet. It's on its knees. Sorry. We have a shortage of teachers and nurses. What we need isn't these kind of vague first steps. Now that Labour are in a position to essentially win this election quite comfortably. What we need is meat on the bones and kind of substantive meat on the bones. And you speak about New Labour. New Labour were in 1997 were bold on quite a few things, right? We can criticise New Labour all day long. I can write a book on New Labour and some of the problems of New Labour. But let's be clear on New Labour. New Labour in 1997 were very, very progressive when it came to things like, poverty, for example. They spoke a lot about challenging child poverty and addressing child poverty in a way that Labour haven't. For example, this current Labour are going to keep the two-child benefit cap, which will, plunge thousands of children into poverty. And it's such a controversial policy that even Gordon Brown and the Church of England, I'm a member of the Church of England, the Church of England has spoken out against it, right? So this is not some kind of radical demand to abolish it. It's actually a demand that holds quite a big sway and big consensus. So I think Labour aren't even doing the bare minimum at the moment. And I think about governments in the past, Labour, when they spoke about poverty, also Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee's government come in at a time when Britain's been decimated by the Second World War, and they don't scale down and try and have these kind of moderate aims. They establish the NHS, welfare, all of these big, big things that still exist today and are still really, really important today. So I think at this moment in time when we see all these problems across Britain, it just feels so inadequate that we're being offered this by Keir Starmer. These are the first steps, given what we face as a nation. It feels like a slap in our faces. And I think the final thing I would say is, how can voters trust Keir Starmer? Everyone's right to label Boris Johnson a liar, and that language was generally the framework in which his behaviour was understood. But Keir Starmer's just as much of a liar, and he crumbles, as you say, Dalia, under the smallest amount of pressure. As soon as there's like a vague criticism of his policies, he's kind of like backtracking slightly and, reframing them ever so slightly. And it's just pathetic. I think this is a moment now where Britain doesn't need moderate, tweaking and slight changes. What we need is radical thinking, a progressive agenda to address the big problems that we face as a nation.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, Mike, that Labour is refusing to lift the two-child benefit cap, something that even Suella Braverman, I believe, has said needs to go. And it's funny, that's when the concrete commitments and the force that Keir Starmer, the conviction that Keir Starmer shows, is always towards the left. It's always punching left. And the commitment that he has made, one of his rare commitments to keep the Tories' two-child benefit cap, has caused anger amongst some of his colleagues, prompting a journalist to ask him this.
Gordon Brown yesterday called for the two-child benefit limit to be scrapped and warned that the UK is heading for the worst child poverty figures in living memory. Where does ending child poverty sit in your list of priorities, and will you rethink your position on the two-child limit?
Ending child poverty is central. It was central to the last Labour government. We did a huge amount of work on it. And it'd be central to an incoming Labour government if we're privileged enough to come in to serve, and we will put a strategy in place for it. And child poverty cannot be divorced from education, from housing, from the cost of living, from bills down. They are all, in a way, feeding into the strategy to deal with poverty. What I can't do is make promises that I can't deliver on. And this is really important to the question about hope, because where we've had to say now, there are things we might want to do, but we can't because the economy is being damaged. I want to say that this side of the election. I do not want to be saying that the other side of the election. And that's tough. The easy thing is just to pretend we can deliver it all. Nice big wheelbarrow of things that we can deliver. But if we can't deliver it, I'm not going to say it, because I think that's the stable foundation we need in politics and now for the economy.
It's not that Starmer can't deliver an end to the two-child cap. It's that he's chosen not to. In January, Starmer committed to backing Rishi Sunak's pledge of £2.5 billion for Ukraine next year. And according to the House of Commons Library, the benefit cap raises exactly that amount for the government each year. In other words, Starmer is choosing to fund Ukraine by continuing to literally tax children into poverty. According to the Child Poverty Action Group, scrapping the cap would only cost £1.3 billion per year, but it would lift 250,000 children out of poverty, and it would lessen the poverty of nearly 1 million more. Now, over on BBC Politics Live, Owen Jones and Labour MP Angela Eagle discussed Keir Starmer's first steps.
Is this going to deliver change?
No. Firstly, there's a question of trust. There's a reason he's not calling these pledges, because that would remind everyone of the pledges he made when he became leader of the Labour Party: public ownership of utilities, taxing the rich in order to invest, scrapping tuition fees, ending private sector.
But he's done that
involvement
already.
in the NHS.
He's done that already. So you saying people won't trust?
Yeah,
these?
I'm saying if a politician with that record of dishonesty, U-turning, I mean, again, £28 billion a year clean investment fund, that he scrapped as well. But the other point is, this doesn't even scratch the surface. Take the pledge he's made on teachers. That amounts to every school in the country getting 0.2 new teachers, a 2% rise in NHS appointments. The problem with what Labour's done is they've firstly backed a fiscal rule, which they have taken from the Conservatives, which means they can't have new investment, backed by the fact they won't increase taxes on those who are booming like never before. So they can't invest in these public services. The other point is, and this is, I think, gets to the core, Angela mentioned why the Labour Party was founded. And it was founded in order to represent working people and those who are struggling. New Labour, for all my problems with New Labour, which we could have a whole programme on, they had an anti-poverty measure, a flagship anti-poverty measure, the minimum wage. This Labour Party has not a single anti-poverty measure, and if it gets worse, it gets worse than that. They support the two-child benefit cap, which drives children into poverty.
The minimum wage wasn't in New Labour's 5 pledges, but we did it when we were in government. These are steps that we're going to take. They're not the entirety of the programme. And if you don't think that Labour is going to make a difference and you're anti-conservative, then what are you actually saying about what should happen at the next election? That you're happy to keep the Conservatives in power? Because the choice will be between a Conservative government and a Labour government.
It's funny how these MPs work day and night to eliminate any possibility of genuine alternatives, thwarting party democracy, insulting their own members who participate in the democratic process to shape what the party looks like. They spend all this time trying to discipline and limit the political imagination of their party members, but also the public more broadly. And then when you get to the election and everyone hates both of the options, they say, well, you've got no other option. It's like, yeah, you're right. We do have no other option. And that's thanks to you and what you've been doing for the past several years. Here's how Owen responded to Eagle's argument.
Well, the Labour's going to win the next election by... Hold on, Angela. Hi. Can I answer this? The Conservatives have trashed themselves and they've destroyed themselves as a party.
So you think it's safe to criticise the Labour Party because
the problem at the moment is all the pressure in politics is coming from those who think we should blame migrants for all our problems, that we should cut taxes on the rich. And we need pressure on the Labour Party from those who think we need to increase taxes on the well-off, which Keir Starmer promised and reneged on. Investing in public services.
To be honest, Owen, I'd welcome pressure on the Labour Party when we're in government, but I think that you've rather taken for granted the next win. Remember that Jeremy Corbyn left us with the worst election result we've had since 1935. I have had to spend the last few years sat in the House of Commons. At the beginning of the Parliament, it's less so now, there were 164 more Conservative MPs than there were Labour MPs. And we have got a mountain to climb to win the next election. Polls are looking good, but we've got to deliver the deal.
Can I answer that quickly?
Very happy, Owen, for you to put pressure on the Labour government when we've got one, but you mustn't assume we're going to get one if you go around saying our leader is dishonest.
Absolutely hilarious. The idea that you should abandon pressure when you have leverage. The fact is...
What leverage have you got, Owen? You've left the Labour Party.
Well, because I can argue for people to vote elsewhere in order to put pressure on the Labour Party to actually stand up for the things that Keir Starmer originally promised in the first place.
But, again, the entitlement of looking at Owen and saying, basically implicitly blaming him if Labour performs weakly in the election, saying, oh, it's because you've gone around and told people that our leader is dishonest. It's like, because the leader is dishonest. So maybe if the leader wasn't dishonest, which is actually the primary issue here, then you wouldn't be at risk of people like Owen Jones, who are obviously really influential and really important for a big sector of society, not being able to publicly back you. So you can't do things that are going to cause someone like with Owen Jones's principles or the kind of political faction that Owen Jones represents. You can't routinely insult their intelligence and then get upset at them for saying, I'm not going to vote for you. But the question of whether Keir Starmer is trustworthy is certainly not one that is going to go away anytime soon. Angela Eagle was further pressed on it again.
The issue of trust and Keir Starmer dropping and changing policies, policies that could fund the sorts of transformational change that many people within Labour would like to see. So increasing taxes, borrowing to invest way beyond.
I don't think he has dropped promises.
Well, he has dropped those two.
Look, I think first of all, he's not an ideologue, he's a pragmatist. And when he made the pledges that Owen was talking about, that was pre-pandemic, pre-war in Europe, pre a range of issues. So you have to have pledges and first steps, whatever you want to call them.
The top 5% of earners.
A manifesto. You have to create a manifesto that's for the times we're in now, not for the times that were happening in 2019, especially after we had...
I have to answer this. I have to answer this, because this is illustrative.
Well, I haven't finished yet.
But it's illustrative of how dishonesty is contagious in politics.
Oh.
Keir Starmer...
Cheers.
Well, it's true.
Owen.
This is true.
No, there's a difference between being an ideologue and
let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. When Keir Starmer was standing to be leader of the Labour Party, he told your former colleague, Andrew Neil, that nationalisation of all the utilities was going to be the next manifesto. He then told Laura Kuenssberg 2 years later that he had never supported nationalisation. Now, if Boris Johnson had done something similar, you would quite correctly be denouncing him for dishonesty. Not because he's your guy.
We're going to take rail into public ownership. We're looking at what to do with some of the other failing utilities as well. I think you should have a little bit more optimism about what Labour government can deliver than you're saying.
Give me a reason to be optimistic and I'll be optimistic. But also, again, another sleight of hand here is the way that she justifies these U-turns, the way that she explains the fact that Keir Starmer doesn't have any clear ideology, doesn't have any clear framework that he can be held accountable to, is, oh, well, we're in a different world now to the one that we were in 2019 when he ran for leader. You know, we've had COVID, we've had, the cost of living crisis. The progressive policies that Keir Starmer was voted into leadership of the Labour Party based on, things like a green transition, a good green investment program, taxing the rich, all of these different things, nationalising utilities. The COVID pandemic and the cost of living crisis are perfect examples of why those policies are necessary. The fact that we've had an economic crisis and a public health crisis that has exposed all the vulnerabilities in our public health infrastructure, the fact that those crises have happened is actually evidence as to why those kinds of systemic policies are needed. But they are because these are the root causes of why the cost of living crisis, of why this public health crisis was felt so acutely in this country, is because the underinvestment in our infrastructures leaves us vulnerable to shocks. And so if you really were about it, you would have used the cost of living crisis, used the COVID pandemic as a reason as to why you actually need to go further in terms of these systemic changes. But in fact, what you've done is you've internalized the conservative logic of a public purse, of this idea of having to balance the books, which we know is an economically discredited way of looking at how to manage a national economy. and you've just completely regurgitated and done the Conservatives' work for them. And this is what we mean by not only the lack of vision, not only the lack of framework, but the fact that even on their best day, the current Labour Party cannot meet the moment. Mike, are you convinced by Angela Eagle's excuses as to why Keir Starmer can't seem to stick on one path?
No, not at all. And I think you make some really good points, Dalia. And what I would say is Starmer joined the leadership contest in 2020, actually made a correct diagnosis, right? So his diagnosis was, we need transformational policies, right? So he's kind of framed these pledges as socialist pledges. I mean, you look at those pledges, they're actually pretty damn good pledges, right? What's happened since then is Keir Starmer has deliberately pivoted from those pledges, right? So those pledges were to move a Labour membership, which at the time was fairly left-leaning because of Jeremy Corbyn, etc., etc. And he's now deliberately pivoted, not because of the war in Ukraine or the COVID-19 pandemic. It's none of that. He's pivoted because he thinks this is the best route to win the election. He's decided to adopt this kind of win at all cost mentality, but also I think ideologically, this is where Keir Starmer is, right? He is kind of a centrist politician, and this is how he views politics. Now, for me, I don't agree with this idea of winning by all costs, right? So we need to win the election by all costs. We need to be elected. The adults need to do what they need to do to win power. That's not how politics works, right? Politics, right, especially in the UK, that period in between elections is fundamental to changing hearts and minds. Talented leaders during that period in between elections are able to make compelling appeals to the nation and are able to compassionately reach out to those who they otherwise wouldn't be able to reach out to, right? So it's not the idea of winning by all cost and by shifting to the right. You need to, make compelling messages and be able to, frame left-wing messages in ways that are appealing to voters. That's how it should be done, rather than kind of pivot to kind of more centrist or centre-right policies. Because what happens there is you're saying to the Conservatives, look, this is the terrain we fight politics on, this kind of centre-right, probably even right to some extent, actually. This is the terrain we fight on, and we're going to shift to your side of the battlefield and fight the battle on these terms. And actually what you need to do in between elections is build a coalition and build a consensus for your ideas, for progressive ideas. So I think Starmer's deliberately chosen this win at all costs, this kind of moderate centrist thinking, which partly aligns to how he thinks and how he and how he sees the world. And you can see his cabinet reflects that as well. His kind of shadow cabinet rather reflects that as well. And I think it's a load of nonsense that this has been driven by change in circumstances, right? Because if anything, the change in circumstances should have reaffirmed to him that those initial 10 pledges were exactly what the nation needed. Because as I mentioned earlier, rising child poverty, rising unemployment, rising homelessness, shortages when it comes to NHS workers and teachers, etc. Those problems don't lend themselves to this kind of shift to the right. Those pledges lend themselves to progressive thinking, radical changes. That's what Britain needs, and that's what Britain wants as well. Britain and British people are in favour of renationalisation. All of these things that we think about as really radical ideas. End of a two-child cap on benefits. All these things that people think are radical are things that most people in Britain actually want to see. So I think, as you mentioned earlier, Dalia, they're so out of sync of what Britain need and what British people want. And it's laughable to kind of frame these changes as necessary evils to gain power, but they're not.
Absolutely. Also, if it's just, it's a narrative that they like to spin to justify their own conservatism. The fact that is just, I think, increasingly I'm believing that it's not, I have believed this for a while, but it's not a kind of concession or a sort of like, I can't do I just don't really believe that you want the same things that the majority of British people want. That's the fact of it. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has given an interview to US channel CNBC. And in it, he gave this very revealing answer.
The two-state solution that people talk about is basically would be the greatest reward for the terrorists that you can imagine. 80% of Palestinians in Gaza and in Judea Samaria and the West Bank support the savagery. Giving them a state would do two things. One, it would be a tremendous reward, a historic precedent of giving those people who committed the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust on a single day, giving them a prize And second, it would be a state that would be immediately taken over by Hamas and Iran, and it wouldn't advance the purposes of peace. It would just be a launching ground for a future war against Israel. I think that that's not in the works, and most Israelis by now, a huge number, would say, don't do that.
Support for a two-state solution is, at least in words, the official policy of almost all of Israel's Western allies. But don't expect there to be any blowback from the US or the UK after Netanyahu appeared to unilaterally rule one out. At this stage, Israel appears to be free to act with total impunity. And we should highlight that it's not Hamas or any other militant group Netanyahu is talking about here. It's all Palestinians who he believes should be denied a state. And from what he says in that clip, it's all Palestinians who Netanyahu believes to be responsible for October 7th. Netanyahu went on to outline his preferred plan for the Palestinians.
We should strive for something that I've long believed we can do in the Middle East, and that is have the populations, the Palestinians, have all the powers that they need to govern themselves, and none of the powers that could threaten Israel's survival. And that means that the military responsibility in the Palestinian areas adjacent to Israel would be left to Israel. Otherwise, Iran comes back in. We left Lebanon, Iran came in with Hezbollah. We left Gaza, Iran came in with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. If we were to do that a third time, the same thing would happen. So that's not good for the Palestinians, it's not good for Israel, it's not good for peace, it's bad for the world. It's not good for America. I think this formula that I say, the Palestinians should have all the powers to govern themselves, but none of the powers to threaten us, that's the right thing. And that, by necessity, means that certain sovereign powers, the most important one being the responsibility for overall security, is maintained with Israel. I think that's the realistic solution.
That is a plan for permanent Israeli military control over the Palestinian territories, turning them into essentially penal colonies. When Netanyahu talks about taking control of the security of the Palestinian territories, he means controlling those territories in the interests of Israel's security. And that would, of course, mean limiting how the Palestinians govern themselves, how they organize their economy, and how they move between Gaza and the West Bank. But Netanyahu's extremist rhetoric appears to have caused a rift in his war cabinet. Speaking after that interview aired, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said this: "I call on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to make a decision and declare that Israel will not exercise civilian rule in the Gaza Strip because no Israeli military administration will be established in Gaza and that an alternative government to Hamas in the Gaza Strip will be advanced immediately. This is our obligation and responsibility in order to lead the state to a better place." Gallant appears to have the support of Benny Gantz, the opposition party leader and third member of Netanyahu's war cabinet. He said this: "Gallant speaks the truth. It is the leadership's responsibility to do the right thing for the country at all costs." But in a further indication that Netanyahu has no intention of allowing Palestinians to govern themselves, he responded to Gallant with this: "I am not ready to replace Hamastan with Fatahstan. The first condition for the day after is to eliminate Hamas and do it without excuses." That's a reference to Fatah, the political party that currently has power in the West Bank. Netanyahu's comments come just days after his national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, spoke at a rally for Israelis who want to settle in Gaza, calling for a, quote, true solution. Ben-Gvir said this about the enclave: "To end the problem, in order that the problem won't come back, we need to do two things. One, return to Gaza now, return home, return to our holy land. And second, encourage emigration, encourage the voluntary departure of Gaza's residents. It is ethical, it is rational, it is right, it is the truth, it is the Torah, and it is the only way, and yes, it is humane." When South Africa presented its genocide case against Israel to the International Court of Justice in January, statements like those of Ben-Gvir were used as evidence of genocidal intent. And South Africa is back in the World Court today, asking the ICJ to issue a new order. Adila Hassim summarized South Africa's request for the court.
"In these submissions, I show that Israel's genocidal attacks against Palestinians in Rafah form part of a continuing, escalating pattern of conduct across Gaza that provides persuasive and consistent evidence of Israel's genocidal conduct. In light of these new facts, South Africa seeks an order from the court, the only order that will clearly protect what is left of Palestinian life in Gaza. It seeks an explicit order that Israel cease its military activities, not only in Rafah, but throughout Gaza.
Israel will be answering South Africa's claims in the ICJ tomorrow. Residents in Devon have been advised to not consume tap water unless they boil it first after a parasitic disease was detected in the drinking supply. The region's water provider, South West Water, issued a boil notice to residents in Brixham, which said the following: "Please do not drink your tap water without first boiling it and allowing it to cool. This applies to water used for drinking, cooking, preparing food, or brushing teeth." The company has set up bottled water stations throughout the region and offered customers £15 for their troubles, a figure that was later increased by £100. The waterborne disease is known as cryptosporidosis, and 22 cases have been confirmed, whilst a further 100 people have reported symptoms to their GP in the past week. One primary school was even forced to close because it was unable to provide running water for its students. Cryptosporidosis typically causes gastrointestinal issues like stomach pain, dehydration, weight loss, and even fever, which can last for up to 3 weeks. However, for immunocompromised people, it can be much more serious and even life-threatening. Local MP for Totnes, Anthony Mangle, has said the source of the outbreak has been identified by South West Water as a damaged air valve. Magnell added that the damage may have allowed animal waste or contaminated groundwater to enter the local supply. Magnell yesterday criticised South West Water for their slow response to the crisis, saying this: "It started with an initial denial that it wasn't anything to do with South West Water's network. And of course, they have now found that the cryptosporidium is in their network and they are responding. Residents were quick to actually point out that there was something wrong with the water. They could taste it, and now they are suffering." The outbreak comes amidst increasing concern over the levels of sewage pollution in England's water system. Over the past year, there has been a 105% increase in the amount of raw sewage being discharged into the country's rivers and seas, which made 2023 the worst year for water pollution. Unlike in other parts of Britain, England's water system is privatised, and as a result, money has been disproportionately funneled towards executive and shareholder pay rather than towards reinvestment in infrastructure. This has left England with an ageing and outdated water system, which is unable to keep up with the demands of increased urbanisation, as well as adverse climate change-induced weather conditions. It's led to customers facing increases in their water bill of between 28 and 70% over the next 5 years. However, at the same time, shareholder profits are skyrocketing. Is that not the mantra of our era? United Utilities provide water for the northwest of England, and today they reported annual pre-tax profits of £170 million and a 17.5% rise in profits for the first quarter of the year. That comes just a day after the BBC revealed that the same company illegally pumped sewage into Lake Windermere for 10 hours in February. That was reportedly caused by a fault at a pumping station, and the company says they are investing in cutting down on sewage spills. However, campaigners say that that's not good enough.
What's being proposed for Windermere is not even going to scratch the surface as what's required to actually protect our lake. And it's not just about the profits that are being made, it's about how much money is being shipped off to shareholders in dividends. Last year alone, United Utilities had a total profit around £300 million, but they sent over £450 million to their shareholders. Since privatisation, the water industry has sent over £72 billion to their shareholders. They racked up £60 billion worth of debt, and the infrastructure is rotting around this system. This is not enough. It's not good enough.
The infrastructure is rotting around the system, kind of literally. Mike, what do you make of that pretty stomach-churning story?
Yeah, it's a horrible story, and it shows us just some of the problems we face as a nation today. I mean, water privatization has been a complete and utter failure. People can't drink water, people can't swim in the water because there's feces in the water. And that's quite like a striking metaphor they did of there are feces in the water. Like we are being, dumped on by these companies in many ways who have no care at all for, kind of maintaining these systems and making sure they're adequate for us. All they care about is their profits, right? And as you said, this is kind of the mantra of our era. The rich are getting richer at our expense, and the kind of services we need, kind of key services we need, are being, left in quite a horrible state, given the current demands of Britain, right? As you say, kind of urbanisation and the kind of transformations in Britain, meaning we need a far more robust system. And I think what people fail to realise is when it comes to public ownership of water, it would not only save us billions of pounds, it make things more efficient and more effective. So it's actually an open goal for any government to kind of push for public ownership because things will get better. It will save us money. So it's a win-win, really. And I don't see why Labour aren't making it. Again, to speak about Labour for a second, I don't know why Labour aren't focusing more heavily on this.
Renowned Israeli and anti-Zionist historian Ilan Pappe says he was stopped and interrogated by the FBI upon arrival at Detroit Airport. Pappe is a professor at the University of Exeter, and he described the ordeal on his Facebook page, stating this. I arrived on Monday at Detroit Airport and was taken for a 2-hour investigation by the FBI, and my phone was taken as well. The two-men team were not abusive or rude, I should say, but their questions were really out of this world. Am I a Hamas supporter? Do I regard the Israeli actions in Gaza a genocide? What is the solution to the conflict? Seriously, this is what they asked. Who are my Arab and Muslim friends in America? How long do I know them? What kind of relationship do I have with them? In some cases, I sent them to my books, and in some cases, I answered laconically yes or no. I was quite exhausted after an 8-hour flight, but that's part of the idea. They had a long phone conversation with someone, the Israelis, and after copying everything on my phone, allowed me to enter. I know many of you have fared far worse experience, but after France and Germany denied entry to the rector of Glasgow University for being a Palestinian, God knows what will happen next. He's referring there to Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta. The good news is actions like this by the USA or European countries taken under pressure from the pro-Israeli lobby or Israel itself smell of sheer panic and desperation in reaction to Israel's becoming very soon a pariah state, with all the implications of such a status. Now, there are some really disturbing details in there. Firstly, that apparently simply having Arab and Muslim friends is considered suspicious or like a national security threat. And it really makes you think about how state officials are being encouraged to think about Arabs and Muslims that live in America. Like if being friends with them is considered a national security threat, then imagine what they think of those who actually are Arab and Muslim. Secondly, he was asked if he considered what was happening in Gaza to be a genocide, as if this would be some kind of unacceptable or radical position, as if UN officials have not routinely described what is happening in Gaza to be a genocide, or as if the ICJ, the highest court in the land, has not found it plausible that Israel's actions in Gaza could amount to genocide, which is arguably the strongest sanction that court can issue within this time frame. Or, of course, as if more than 40,000 Palestinians haven't been killed in the past 6 months, along with the majority of essential life-saving infrastructure and food supply being destroyed, meaning that those who have not been bombed or are not dying under the rubble are being slowly starved to death. So by all measures, the opinion that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide is an entirely rational and mainstream opinion. Not only does it reflect the position of several mainstream multilateral institutions, it even reflects the position of many ordinary people in the US. A poll earlier this year found that 35% of Americans believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and 29% were undecided. And bear in mind, that poll was taken before the ICJ issued its groundbreaking ruling, which one would of course guess would have probably pushed more of those undecided camp into the yes camp. But Professor Pappe is right. This kind of harassment and silencing indicates an insecurity about where the popular mood is right now and what the future of Israel might look like. Some of you might remember a similar thing happened to Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, the British Palestinian surgeon who witnessed firsthand the medical crisis unfolding in Gaza. After being denied entry into Germany earlier this month, he was slapped with a year-long ban from entering the Schengen area, a ban that has now been lifted. But following his detention, this is what he said in front of the German embassy in London.
So today we saw how accomplices in a crime behave. Accomplices in a crime try to hide the evidence and silence the witnesses. And as if wanting to admit to the Nicaraguan charges in front of the ICJ that they are accomplices to the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people, the German state decided to behave like an accomplice and try to silence the voices of witnesses to the crimes. They are no different than any common gang. One does the killing, the other one does the burial, and the other one gets rid of the evidence. But today, they have not counted on the fact that the world has changed. And the international response to this crime of trying to silence Palestinian voices has backfired on them.
It's a powerful summary there of that kind of insecurity that Professor Pappe has described. A 74-year-old man has been informed by the Home Office that he is not British, despite having lived in the country for more than 40 years. Nelson Shadi came to the UK in 1977 to study accountancy. He was on a student visa, which also allowed him to work. A coup in Ghana meant his family could no longer pay the fees, and so Mr. Shadi withdrew from his studies. He went on to support himself with various jobs in the food industry and eventually set up his own newsagents in Merseyside. During his 4 decades in the UK, Shadi has served on a jury, married twice, and had 2 sons, and paid off a mortgage on his house. In 2007, he was even given a police award for bravery after tackling a robber who was armed with a baseball bat. Essentially, he appears to be the definition of what the state would call an upstanding citizen. And yet, it was only when he applied for a passport to return to Ghana after his mother died that he learned he was not welcome in the country. And indeed, being upstanding is not good enough. After the Home Office told him he had no right to remain in the UK, it encouraged Shadi to pursue the 10-year route settlement that will cost him around £7,000 in fees and a further £10,500 to access the NHS. Let's remember that this man has been paying taxes in the UK for 42 years and yet in his older age isn't able to use its public services. Shadi, who is recovering from prostate cancer, told the BBC this: "I cannot afford to pay any part of the money they are asking. Telling me to go through that route is a punishment, and it's not fair in any way. I don't understand why this fuss at all, because I put my life, my whole self into this country." Shadi's son Jacob is a medical researcher, and he told the BBC this: "I just thought it was a joke. It's just ridiculous. Why would he need to go and start this 10-year route when he's been here since 1977? He's been here longer than the people who are working in the Home Office on his case have been alive." Nicola Burgess is a lawyer at Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit, and she's helping Shadi take the Home Office to court. And she said this about his case: "We know that at least one caseworker has looked at his file and suggested that he should be granted indefinite leave to remain because these are exceptional facts. And when you look at it on a personal level, if Nelson was your friend or your neighbour, you would absolutely agree that he should be given the immediate right to settle." Mike, now, I don't believe he's not in the Windrush generation, but Shadi's story is kind of very reminiscent of the Windrush scandal. And I think to me kind of speaks of this fact that, they try to make all these arguments that like, oh, the reason that we're against immigration is because it's a strain on the economy, or it's a strain on public services, or they're just not like us. They're causing, people of color, immigrants, whatever, causing crime, whatever. So when you have someone who lives by the book in this way, and the fact that it just goes to show that this is never about anything other than we just don't like non-white people in our country. What do you make of that?
Absolutely, and I think it's a sign that the kind of bureaucratic incompetence of the Home Office has real human consequences, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a good or bad immigrant, right? Your life is made difficult by the incompetence of that kind of institution organization in many ways, right? So another notion that's banded around, Dalia, is the idea that, well, actually, no, if you're a good immigrant, we're going to make life easy for you. You're going to be able to integrate into this country fairly easily. This is a man who, by all accounts, and by the kind of good immigrant rhetoric, he ticks all the boxes, right? He's lived here, he's paid his taxes, set up a business, he's had a son who's then gone on to work for the civil service, I believe, and done good things there, I imagine. Yet even he's been treated like a stranger in a country he's contributed to and given his life to. So these are systems that just reproduce harm, no matter if you're a good immigrant or a bad immigrant. And immigration policy for so many years, especially in the post-war years in this country, has been designed by both parties to reproduce harm against people of color. That's the entire essence of the immigration system in this country. So you speak about, for example, to stop the boats. And no one ever in mainstream politics speaks about safe routes. Right? That's the way, if you want to stop the boats, those are the ways in which you want to stop the boats, right? So the entire way in which our immigration kind of policies operate in this country, they're inadequate, but they also just reproduce harm no matter who you are. And I think this is so similar, as you mentioned, Dalia, to the Windrush scandal, right? The Windrush scandal, so many people to this day are still waiting for compensation. And this is partly because the compensation scheme places so many barriers in front of those seeking compensation. I read earlier that the son of those who've passed away, or the children of those who've passed away and want to seek compensation, have to prove they're related to their parents through a DNA test. And they've described this as these children as degrading, and it is. This is a system that reproduces harm. It's degrading to the victims of kind of injustice by the system. It's a total nonsense, right? So the whole problem is the system that continues to harm these people, and it is so similar to the Windrush scandal. And I think moving forward, what we need is a real rethinking about how we approach immigration, a system that's compassionate, that's fair, that's just. These are kind of the core principles of any immigration system. And at the moment, stories like Nelson's story are a reminder that we're so far away from that reality.
And I think it's a real testament to the fact that if you are a person of color in this country who, even if you have all your papers, you have your passport, you have everything, you are deeply staked in resisting the way that the immigration system not only is going, but has already gone. You are deeply staked in resisting this anti-migrant populist policy, rhetoric, politics that has infected basically every single layer of society in this country. Because your passport, we wear our passport on our faces, as Sivanandam said. So yeah, we're deeply staked in each other's fates. Mike, thank you so much for joining me tonight. That was a real long show, but you stuck with it.
It was a fun show. Really enjoyed it.
And thanks everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.